Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Today we have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about the breed Parlor Roller with D from Loco D's Loft. He has just released the first ever book on Parlor Rollers called The Prime Roll. You can get that at Amazon. It's the guide for Parlor Roller breeding and training. Thanks so much for coming on and talking with us today, D.
It's an honor to be a part of the show. I think that the book would actually not exist had you not played your part in it. We got to give you your due credit for taking the step to make it happen.
Oh man, any kind of part that I can take at that book, that's so cool that it's finally out. I've been looking for years on a book on Parlor Rollers and talking to collectors, and it's just not been found. There's some old journals and, magazines and stuff, but an actual book, that's really special. I'm glad that's out there. I think this is really going to help the breed, honestly.
Everything in that book is just something I learned off of somebody else. I think it's harder because, the older guys, they're all not raising parlors anymore. I think I was fortunate enough to get into Parlor Rollers when I was a kid to meet all the older guys.
So how was that introduction into Parlor Rollers?
I got my first Parlor Rollers in the early 2000s from a gentleman named Wally Vang. At that time, I didn't know what they were called. They were just ground rolling pigeons. So I called them ground rolling pigeons, right? At that time, the internet was new. There were sites where you could go on to chat forums and all that. I met a gentleman. His name was Terry Duez. He's no longer with us anymore, but he was one of the founders for the American Parlor Roller Association, the APRA. He was the one who told me that they were called Parlor Rollers. And I probably bugged the crap out of him and a lot of, people that were in the APRA, because at that time, all I knew was these birds were ground rolling pigeons. So I called them ground rolling pigeons. And it started from an online conversation, and I learned more about the breed. And I was fortunate enough to have a lot of older guys, like, let's say around the time that I started, I was 12, 13, 14. Everybody else was 30 or older. They were willing to answer my emails and all my questions and all that. And without those guys, I probably, my Parlor Rollers wouldn't be where they are today without the conversations that I had with those guys.
Do you know much about the history of the breed? Where did these pigeons originally come from?
That right there, it's hearsay because I can't really say that I wasn't there, right? But based on what everybody's saying, they're all originally from Scotland. But then I guess the Parlor Roller was a breed that came out of the Indian Lotan. The Indian Lotan, they roll on the ground as well, but they're not clean-footed like the Parlor Rollers, and their beaks are a lot longer. They actually look more like an owl than they look like a tumbler. I think parlors right now, they look more like, have you ever seen Budapest face tumblers?
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think their type is extremely similar to that.
With this breed, because it is a ground roller, what kind of housing do you do with this breed? I mean, we've kind of talked before about open loft cage setups. What's the best way to have these things set up for breeding and then for housing and training and stuff like that?
Best way to keep your bird, in my opinion, is individual breeding cages. Like rabbit hutches. One skill set that I learned how to make cages. I could go to Home Depot, buy myself some wire mesh and buy some rebar ties, and I could mold a cage. Parlor rollers are better raised in cages than they are in an open loft environment.
What kind of issues would they have being in an open loft?
If the loft is big enough, the parlors are going to try to fly. And if they fly, they will ruin themselves because instead of flying, they'll be rolling. If you're not there to supervise them at all times, then they could injure themselves. They're very, very sensitive type of pigeon.
So you mentioned flying, right? Everyone's like, oh, they're a completely flightless bird, but that's not true then. Is it just when they're young, or do some parlor rollers always have that capability?
It really depends on the parlors that you have. I've seen some parlors where they'll roll for like 3-4 minutes, and then once you have them back inside the cage, like they're flying to the top of a perch. So
Right after. Wow.
yeah, it really depends, because that I recently had a bird that went 4 minutes, right? That bird's mom was a phenomenal roller, but what she would do was basically, if you had her out in the open loft, she would actually fly. She wouldn't roll. If she was outside of the cage or the loft, I mean, like, it's possibly 3 feet high at the highest, and it's a 4x8. If you had that mom outside, that mom would roll like a parlor, but if it was inside the cage, it would fly like, a regular pigeon.
So weird.
Yeah, she's a phenomenal breeder, though. She's, in my opinion, I like birds like that, where they don't show signs of rolling inside the cages, just because they're better parents that way. If they roll inside the cages, they're going to damage the babies or the eggs.
And that's something I've heard about too, is that they're hard to breed because they roll on their eggs or they roll on their babies, get startled, and just start dropping spins.
There's certain ways that you could prevent that. You could actually, pluck their flight feathers so that way they don't, when they try to fly, they don't have enough lift to continue their backflips. You could pluck their flight feathers, or if not, then you could use some kind of barrier where it protects the nests. Parlors, they're a very, very extremely hard breed, because if you breed them too close to the performance side, then the birds are they're gonna go crazy inside the loft. But if you breed them too far from the performance side, then they're going to be good parents, but then those babies are going to be harder to get to start training.
Right. And so you used to be a member of the American Parlor Roller Association, which was a club that would compete, correct?
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit about how the breed competes? Do they base it off of how long the bird rolls time wise or how far the bird rolls distance wise? How that all goes down?
it was established that if the bird rolled more than 70 feet away, stop. If the bird stopped at least 70 feet away from the starting point, then it would certify. It didn't matter if the bird would roll for 5 minutes out and then come back 4 minutes in. As long as the bird stopped at least 70 feet or more away from the starting point, then that bird would be certified. They used to judge it based on distance, and they would measure it with those measuring wheels.
Yeah.
They would use those measuring wheels to determine how far the bird rolled. In my opinion, that kind of gave like some birds, a disadvantage, because I've seen some birds that will roll like to 300 feet, and then all of a sudden they hit a bump or something like that, and then that bird would actually come back to 50 feet. And now, okay, so the bird basically covered 550 feet, but because the bird stopped not beyond the 70-foot line, that bird didn't certify. But deep down inside, if you were there to witness it, that bird would have been a 550 footer. That would have been a good breeder.
They don't go with like forward progression. So if it comes back, that's it.
Yeah, just the starting point and the ending point. One of the disadvantages that they had, I think, in terms of competition, I think everybody had really, really good birds. The time when the APRA was most active, even after Terry Duez passed away, there weren't a lot of fields that accommodated the parlor rollers. Like turf is something that is extremely new. You would get birds that certify 70 feet or more, and then those birds, who knew what they did? They could have went 1,000 feet and came back, or they could have just rolled all the way to where the bird stopped at 70 feet, and then, okay, all right, this bird's certified. It was a little bit different because those parlor rollers, they were developed to roll on natural grass. And so, like, right now, a lot of people, what they don't realize is that with turf and with just the way that the lawns are now, it's a little bit easier to get parlor rollers to roll 2 minutes or more as compared to back then.
Easier to get to good conditions.
Yeah, grass is a lot shorter. The lawns are more well maintained. I've seen parlor rollers evolve, because even my strain of parlors, they've evolved. I have more of a loose feather kind of parlor roller now, because when they roll on turf, it doesn't require as much grip as a hard feather pigeon would require. Not sure if you're a stiffler on feather quality, but for me, I am, right? So back in the day, you would have needed a harder feather bird, because it would have gave your birds more traction when they were rolling inside the field. But now, since it's turf, you could go with a softer feathered parlor roller, and the parlors would still be able to go the distance.
What are some of the spots that you're able to roll? I mean, do you go to parks or football fields, soccer fields?
You got to find the needle in the haystack. Here in Sacramento, there's only two spots that are within driving distance. One would be Nugget Field, where I like to go, which is in Davis, California, and then the other one would be in Laguna at the Bartholomew Sports Complex. There's actually a gentleman who actually rolled his birds at the sports complex, and he had two birds go over 4 minutes.
Nice.
Yeah, Pee Wee.
Okay, yeah, I've seen his stuff on Facebook.
Yeah, me and Pee Wee, all our birds go back to the same guy, same family. It seems like with that field and the family of birds that we have, it's easier for us to get the distance that we want. I think I seen on your post you had what, a black and white flight that looked promising.
It's my most consistent one. It always rolls something. It's not breaking any world records, like I said, but it's just consistent. It seems to be doing really good.
How old is that cock?
That's probably 5 years now.
I think you could probably squeeze a couple of babies out of him.
Yeah, yeah, he's still breeding right now. I got him in a cage behind me right now. If you hear some noise, no, I just got him paired up with another kite bird because I don't have any other black with white flights. I got some other kites, so I'm going to try to put him on that. See, can you talk about some of the different families of birds that there are? Birmingham rollers and stuff. There's like the Higgins and the Mason, and then of course with racers, you get all the different bloodlines. And that's why I made that post. I was like, these blacks with the white flights. What bloodline is that? Can you talk somewhat about the bloodlines and where they're coming from?
The thing is that there were a lot more different quote unquote bloodlines during the APRA days. Basically, a bloodline is just basic what a fancier has developed throughout the year. I think ultimately, parlor rollers, they all go back to one guy who imported the birds here into America. I'm not quite sure who he is, but I know that in the 70s, there was only one gentleman who had parlor rollers. I'm pretty confident that, parlor rollers came from that gentleman. Lines are developed a little bit different. Let's say your bird that had the black and white flight line, I'm just suspecting that it goes back to the Merrill Peters family from Paul Gamino. That family right there, well, you got to take a good look at the birds and then see what the babies are doing, because I could say that it has a chance of coming from that family, but only you would know that bird, because there's certain characteristics within that family that only that particular family has.
Yeah, we definitely can't do an episode on parlor rollers and not bring up Paul Gamino. He's currently the world record holder.
Yeah.
I should have that distance. I know it's like 1,200 and some feet, right?
Yeah, so 1,200 200 feet, and I'm pretty sure that bird that you have in your loft looks like it's from that family.
Oh, I'm getting excited here. You go through a lot of this different stuff in your book. You mentioned lock in the roll on a lot of things. And I remember reading an article on Parlor Rollers once. They say, oh, you want to let your bird roll, but then you want to grab your bird so it doesn't learn how to stop. So that way, when it comes to the day of competition, you can just let that bird loose and, see what you got. What are your thoughts on that?
You got to figure out the birds that you're working with. Some families, they require you to lock them in. What I mean by locking in is get the birds to where they're rolling past 10 feet, where they look like they're locked into the roll, where they're not going to stop anymore. Some families would require for you to lock them in, for them to actually get to that point where they're rolling. And some families, you could just take them out to the field on the first try and they're going to take off. Locking in is a guarantee. If you don't lock in your birds aren't going to perform. But yeah, there is a chance where the birds will learn how to stop, just because they're already rolling. Because the rolling factor, it's not something natural for pigeons. For Birmingham rollers, for some of the family of Birmingham rollers that I've seen, they love to roll. It gets them excited. But for parlor rollers, it seems like it's more involuntary, and then it'll try to eventually learn how to stop. But your goal is to see it perform right when it hasn't learned how to stop yet, just to see if you're like me, where you're somebody who likes to see a potential out of the bird, then you will try to maximize that potential. And the thing is that there's a lot of people that don't like parlor roller breeders because they don't understand that. They think what we're doing is we're hurting the birds by rolling them. But thing is that in order for you to get a bird that performs super well, you have to really take care of your birds. Locking in is just basically it's a method. It's just based on the family of birds that you have. If your birds require you to lock in, then you're gonna have to lock them in, get them going before you take them out to the field. What it is a lot of people, they don't know what they have in their loft. Since they don't know what they have in their loft, they don't know how to get the maximum roll potential out of them.
It seems like I hear a lot of people always talk about, I'm really into racers, but I got a pair of parlor rollers to show some friends, or I'm really into this. But it seems like everybody has like at least a pair or two of parlor rollers in their loft. And you've mentioned before that they are a difficult bird to breed.
Yeah.
What are some of the problems that you face when it comes to breeding? I've talked about like the rolling in the nest and things like that. What would be some of the other problems that you'd see, and what would be some of the ways you could get around that and solve that problem?
I would say most of the time, if a lot of people have parlor rollers in their loft, but those parlors aren't breeding, it's because they're not in individual cages. It's probably an open loft setup. Well, an open loft setup, just basically, parlors are very, very sensitive to noises. If it sounds like there's anything that could spook a parlor, that parlor is going to start rolling. You kind of cancel it out when you throw them into a more confined space. Pluck the wings. If they get a little bit too crazy inside the cage, they'll work their magic as long as you just learn how to take care of them. There's a lot of different approaches when it comes to taking care of your parlor rollers, but at the end of the day, if the parlors are making babies and those babies are growing up, then you're doing something right.
Stick with what works, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever foster? Or are they pretty good about raising their own babies?
Last year I used fosters just because there's just a lot of people in the local area that I helped get started. I utilize fosters. It kind of ruined the original breeders because now they don't really try to take care of the eggs anymore. At this point, I have certain people who already have the family of birds that I have, and so therefore I have an insurance plan.
There you go. Yeah, I know you just recently were out of the country for a while, and I saw that a lot of your birds got moved around. Yeah, you can always keep that family alive at least that way because they're gone to good breeders.
Yeah, well, some of these breeders they had to earn it.
That's one of the points that you make in your books. I think it's a really important one. And I will say there's two sides of it, but you make the mention of you want to be a parlor roller breeder, not a parlor roller buyer, just because the market is just so one-sided, right? Everybody wants them, but doesn't seem like very many people are breeding them or breeding them successfully. And I get why that there's a lot of people that want them because it is just a limited supply of them in that way. But at the same time, I do feel that there is this side of they are a little bit more difficult to breed. A lot of breeds are, especially, you get the fancy breeds and stuff like that where you have to foster. That's one of the things I think in your book you really do talk a lot about. You break it down, even the breeding cages, you have dimensions and everything laid out to where it's pretty laid out right in front of you to have success with breeding these things.
Those are just methods that I learned that worked for me. It may not work for everyone else, but it worked for me. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything like that, but it worked for me. And I have videos of my birds in action. you, you
Yeah,
know,
you've got
so
some really good rollers though, man. I mean, I've really enjoyed watching some of those.
they're real good. The thing is that parlors are hard to take care of, right? I emphasize that a lot just because there's some people that they already have parlors, but then they're not breeding from the parlors that they have, and it's like, okay, you want birds from me, but you haven't seen the potential that of the family of birds that you already have, right? That you're already working with. If you play with your parlors and you like, I basically can't really trust anybody with the family of birds that I've built just because they want them. They have to show me that they're kind of serious for them to actually have access to my line. Like Pee Wee, he earned his respect. I know I gave him quite a bit of a hard time, but he showed me the signs that he was going to be somebody serious. And right now, he's surpassed me. I gave him birds, and he bred out of them, and he has what, 3 or 4 of birds that have rode beyond 4 minutes.
I've heard that a bunch from other pigeon fanciers who are like, it'd be great to give somebody some birds and have them beat me with my own bloodline later on down the road. It shows what's, potential really is.
It's hard trying to get other people started too, because at one point in time I gave over like 200 parlor rollers to a lot of people here in Sacramento, right? And out of those 200, only 3 birds survived.
Oh my gosh, man, that's crazy.
Yeah, so 18 or 19 people that I gave parlors to, and I didn't just give them like one pair, I gave them like 2 or 3 pairs, and it's kind of discouraging because when I try to come back in and I look for the line that I had distributed out, all the birds had died out already. It hurts when you put that many years into a certain specific family, and you think you're doing a good thing, and by the time you know it, like, you're looking for the birds and all those birds are dead.
It's terrible, man. I understand, the American Parlor Roller Association club that was for this breed, especially the competition side of it, is no longer. And that's kind of worrisome, right? Because I've said before that, this breed doesn't have a standard in the NPA book of standards here in the States. So no one's really bringing them for show. And without a club that competes, you're not seeing them there either. I feel like that's probably another reason that's feeding into this factor of why they're just getting hard to find and becoming really high in demand. I'm gonna, shout out that book again. Anytime a breed has a breed specific book, I feel like that just helps the breed overall. And, it's a step in the right direction. That'd be great if the American Parlor Roller Association did get back up and going again and you did start seeing some competitions.
Well, the sad thing is that the majority of the original members, they're all retired, so they don't have time to take care of the birds, or if not, then they're no longer here with us. We lost a lot of guys recently. Paul Ramirez was one of the guys that he was younger, and I was looking forward to him, trying to bring back the club, and then all of a sudden, news that he passed away. It seems like the majority of the people that are experienced with parlor rollers, those guys are no longer a part of it. They're no longer able to care anymore. Like the family of birds that I have, they're Sean Moeller based, right? Which goes back to Jay Trow. I bought the original birds that I got. They were from Keith Caserta, right? Keith bought the birds from Sean because Sean had developed dementia. It was hard for Sean to remember his birds. Sean was a real good breeder. He had a bird that went over like 1,000 feet, and he bred off that specific bird. When I got the birds from Keith, a couple months later, Keith developed COVID, and thank God he's still around. But in between that time when he was at the hospital, nobody could take care of his parlor rollers, and so like he lost the majority of birds that he had. There's also a gentleman named Mike Bryard, and he's in Martinez, so maybe about an hour drive from where I am here in Sacramento. He had the same family of birds, but Falcon got in. He fosters the eggs from the open loft. Falcon got in, killed all his birds, and parlors they're not predator proof. It's hard to maintain the line. The breeders have to really maintain them well, and then the breeders have to still healthy as well. And it seems like everybody else that were a part of the APRA, they're all way beyond the retirement age right now.
Well, there are Facebook groups. I think there's at least a couple. I know there's actually, I just saw one the other day that was a Parlor Roller of the Philippines, and then there's the West Coast Parlor Roller Club, Central something Parlor Roller Club. There's a few Facebook groups for Parlor Roller Club. Some guys are posting videos and are pretty active on there. Hopefully that can be an outlet right now until a club can get formed again for guys to get together and compete. I saw a couple posts on there where some guys were getting together at a park in California. They had wheels and everything else, and they were competing, right?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately you yourself that can actually get the breed going, because at the end of the day, I'm borrow words from Paul Gamino, but at the end of the day, I'm probably gonna die in my loft, you know, and
It's not a
and
bad way to go, man.
well, the thing is it's hard to find somebody who will have the discipline to actually be able to breed parlors and still continue to have that fascination with that breed, to continue to have the breed thrive in their loft. It's hard for me to encourage anybody else, but I could always encourage myself. The parlor roller has been a part of my life ever since I was a kid, and there's still going to be some parlors in my backyard until the day I croak. It's hard to get a club going. Even in the APRA core group of guys, they were in the Midwest that held it down for a couple of years before they called it quits.
There's still some Parlor Roller competitors in like the Ohio area.
Yeah, Ohio area, that likely are birds that they've survived. But if they have Ohio bands, they're probably from Keith Caserta. He's been helping out a lot of breeders out there. Also, I don't know if Larry Jensen is still around or not. He's a little bit older, but if he's still around, I'm pretty sure he still has birds as well.
There's such a variety of pigeon breeds to begin with, and the performing breeds especially really fascinate me. Breeds that you can interact with. This is definitely one of those breeds that get pointed out. They talk about what selective breeding can lead to. What are you trying to get out of these birds, and you breed for that. And it's a breed that you can really interact with and have a lot of fun with. And they come in beautiful colors and they're very pretty to look at, even and you're breeding them and working with them.
Yeah, the parlor roller of today, they're a lot different from the parlor rollers of back then in terms of the different colors that they now have. When I got into parlor rollers, there was just a handful of colors. You would get duns, yellows, blacks, or a combination of those reds, or a combination of those with the grizzle factor in it. Now parlors have developed to a point where there are blue bars, there are indigos, there are reduced. During those days, there were some guys that they crossed different families, different pigeons into parlors to get those colors going. They're definitely a colorful bunch, and when you get the opportunity to actually hang out with, they're a little bit more timid than the other breeds of pigeons, but then they have their own characters too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if anybody has had their interest sparked hearing about this breed, you haven't heard about it before, or if you're a Parlor Roller breeder just jumping on here to learn more about them, that next step would be definitely jump on some of these Facebook groups for Parlor Roller. I'm sure if you just search Parlor Roller, you'll see the groups pop up there. And check out his book. His book has just come out recently. It's called The Prime Roll, and you can just search that up on Amazon, get it sent to you. Lots of information. Like I said, guys, it's a laid out thing that he put out here for everybody. really going to help the breed overall. Coming on here to the podcast, another thing that he's doing to try to help out. So, D, thanks so much for coming on and talking Parlor Rollers today. This has been fantastic.
All right, Philip. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast, and make sure to leave a good review or at least a 5-star for the podcast wherever you listen. If you have a topic or a person you want to hear more about on the podcast, or if you yourself would like to be a guest, just send an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.